Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the celebration of our newest special exhibition, Kindertransport: Rescuing Children on the Brink of War. I'd like to start by extending a very special thank you to our exhibition sponsors. Our supporting sponsors are the Texas Historical Commission and the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Antisemitism Advisory Commission. We're also very grateful to our partner sponsors, American Airlines, Dallas Tourism Public Improvement District, Friends of the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Antisemitism Advisory Commission, and NFI Industries. And additional support has been provided by Larry Ginsberg. Please help me thank our wonderful sponsors. I'm also excited to thank our incredible exhibition community partners. They help us get the word out about our programs and the exhibition to the broader community, so we're very grateful. Bear with me, this is a long list. Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at UT Dallas, ADL Texoma, AJC Dallas, Big Brothers Big Sisters Lone Star, Educational First Steps, Green Hill School, Hope Supply Company, Southwest Jewish Congress, Vogel Alcove, and the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. What an incredible group of sponsors and community partners. Thank you all so much for your steadfast support. I would also like to extend a special welcome to our board members who are here, our museum members, our volunteers, and members of our Generations Council. We couldn't do this work without you, and I'm so grateful for your support. If you're in the audience and you'd like to get engaged, please contact me, go to the website. We'd love for you to become a member or a volunteer. We really need your help continuing with this work. Our website is the initials of the museum, dhhrm.org. So please go there to learn more. We are honored to host Kindertransport through February 16th, 2026. This exhibition was created and organized by Yeshiva University Museum and the Leo Baeck Institute, New York, Berlin. It showcases the astonishing rescue effort that brought thousands of unaccompanied children from Nazi-occupied Europe to the United Kingdom. This poignant exhibition serves as a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of honoring the legacy of those who endured unimaginable suffering. If you've not yet seen the exhibition, I encourage you to do so, either after the program, we'll stay open until 9 p.m., or coming back during regular museum hours. This exhibition is near and dear to all of us at the museum, as we have had the privilege of having brother and sister Kindertransport survivors active in our community for many years. Both born in Germany, Maggie Romberg first in 1929 and Bert Romberg in 1930. They survived the war thanks to the Kinder rescue efforts. They have told their story of their experiences to thousands of students and visitors at the museum over the years. And we are heartbroken by the recent passing of Bert just a few weeks ago on August 27. We miss him dearly. Bert is survived by his wife Terry, his 3 daughters, and his sister Maggie. We are honored to have with us tonight 2 of his daughters, Paula and Hannah. Thank you for being with us. Tonight's program is dedicated to Bert. He would always end his talks at the museum by saying, "This is a happy story. We survived. For every one of us who survived, 150 children did not." May Bert's memory be for a blessing. And now I'd like to welcome our featured speaker to the stage. Melissa Hacker is the daughter of a Kindertransport survivor from Vienna and serves as the executive director of the Kindertransport Association, an organization that connects Kindertransportees and their descendants with others, shares their stories, and supports children at risk today. She was previously the first second-generation survivor to serve as the president from 2013 until 2023. Hacker continues to speak internationally on the Kindertransports. In fact, she's just come to us from Paris, and consults on major exhibitions, preserving and sharing the stories of this pivotal moment in history. She's also a filmmaker and professor. Hacker made her directorial debut with My Knees Were Jumping, Remembering the Kindertransports, which was shortlisted for Academy Award nomination. Before I welcome her to the stage, I have just a few housekeeping items. As always, we welcome audience questions. Please write your questions on the note cards you were given as you entered the theater. And as we approach the end of her talk, please raise your note cards and we'll get to as many of them as possible. Our staff will come by and pick them up. I also ask that you silence your cell phones and electronic devices so we may all enjoy the program without disruption. Now, it's my honor to turn things over to Melissa Hacker.
As always, my first move is to lower the mic. Thank you all from the museum for inviting me to speak today. I'm really sorry that I've arrived after the death of Bert Romberg. He was a longtime Kindertransport Association member, and his sister is a member of the Kindertransport Association Speakers Bureau. And I was looking forward to seeing both of them. And I'm grateful also that his daughters are here and I could meet them. So I want to first start with a disclaimer. To be clear, I am not a historian, but I am the daughter of a Kindertransport survivor from Vienna, a filmmaker who made the first documentary on the Kindertransports, My Knees Were Jumping, Remembering the Kindertransports, and I am the executive director of the Kindertransport Association. So I have both lifelong lived experience of the Kindertransports and professional experience. I've also just come from 4 days in Paris at the 35th annual conference of the World Federation of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants. We were 300 survivor generations, including 100 survivors, gathered together with attendees from 14 countries. So tonight, my head and my heart are full of stories and a few visions of Paris, as many of us managed to sneak out from the conference for just a few minutes at least. So this image that you see here is of me filming with my mother, the Kindertransport survivor. And she's participating fairly patiently. Let's see. Yeah. As I filmed an interview with her for what was my first film. When I was growing up in New York City, my mother did not talk about her childhood or her Kindertransport experience with my sister or myself. We absorbed bits and pieces, not enough details to tell a linear story. Can I just have a raise of hands to see who's second generation here? Okay, nice. So you may be familiar with this bits and pieces and not enough to tell a linear story. And also not being able to ask because it's this terrible, they don't want to upset us and they also don't want to tell their story to someone like a teenager who might not be able or willing to listen, and we don't want to hurt them by asking. So it was only when I was making the film and had this project between us, that my mother was proud that I was interested in this part of world history and Jewish history, and that I was interested in her story. She was also relieved that after dropping out of college and moving to Seattle, I had, after a few years, moved back to New York and was potentially interested in something that could become a career. So it was only under these conditions that she sat down with me and I was able to ask, and she was willing to answer questions. So I want to share a little bit of my personal family history before I widen the frame to talk about the larger Kindertransport history. In 1938, my grandparents had tried to leave Vienna as a family, but they were not able to, even though they had, as my grandfather has recorded in his diaries, affidavits from his sister in New York saying that people would help support them so they wouldn't become a burden. You needed to have affidavits to get to the U.S. It wasn't my grandfather's sister who signed the affidavits, as she had no money. She had come from Vienna to New York on her own and was working as a secretary to the publisher of the Staatsherald, a German language newspaper, but she was able to, through her boss, find people who would sign these. My mother and her mother were born in Vienna, and they were on the American quota. They were on the Austrian quota to America. My mother's father was born in the Bukovina, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, then Poland, for a brief moment Romania, and now Ukraine. But he was on the Polish quota to the U.S., and his number wasn't coming up, and my grandmother refused to leave without her husband. So I bring up the subject of quotas and numbers, as many people think that a reason that more Jews did not leave Germany was because the Nazi policies did not allow them to leave. When I first started talking about the Kindertransports, as I was doing research for my film, the first question people asked, because no one knew of the Kindertransports then, was, why did the Nazis allow them to leave? Of course they allowed Jewish people to leave. Emigration was Nazi policy. The one thing they did do with the Kindertransports was that they mostly left at night, and the parents were not allowed, in many cases, on the platform. They wanted to make sure that no one saw scenes of children being sent away without their parents, because even though they were Jews, who were by then not human, they still thought that it was possible that people would have emotional reactions to these scenes of parents and children being separated. But in the years and months before the start of the war, the Nazi government wanted Jewish families to leave. They would need to leave nearly everything behind: property, savings, belongings. And they had to get proof that they didn't owe any debt and get permission from various agencies to leave. My aunt asked her landlord in Vienna for a letter saying that she did not owe any rent. Her landlord reported to the police that she had asked for this letter, and she was arrested and in jail for 5 days. My mother remembered going to visit her older sister and seeing her wearing a coat that my mother had really liked, and it was crawling with lice. But they could leave. However, few countries would let them in. If any of you have seen the Ken Burns PBS documentary, America and the Holocaust, it's a documentary series, you'll be familiar with the U.S. response to this rising terror. My grandfather walked from embassy to embassy in Vienna, applying for permission to immigrate. To England, Ireland, Venezuela, anywhere out of reach of the Nazis. He carried a note written in English explaining that he had been a pharmacist until his business was taken away, and that he had a 12-year-old daughter at home who could no longer go to school. The United States and other countries had small quotas, and the U.S. kept their quota unfilled, as they did not want to take in penniless Jewish refugees. And I Today was my first visit here, so I saw in the really wonderful permanent exhibit that it goes into that a little bit. There was a refugee crisis. People were not safe in their home countries, and very few safer countries would let them in. The Kindertransports were one small exception to this rule. All right. There we go. When my grandparents, this is my grandparents and my mother in traditional Austrian clothing. They didn't wear this all the time. This was probably on a summer, it's by a lake, so it's on a summer vacation outside of Vienna. But I'm just showing it to show that they really believed they were Austrian as they would pose for a family photo in lederhosen and white knee socks. But they all seem quite happy, although my mother does look a little puzzled. But they were Austrian. So when my grandparents put their 12-year-old daughter, who had never before crossed the street alone, on a train carrying refugee children to England, she did not know that she was one of the thousands of children saved by the Kindertransports. Out of the ashes of the pogrom of November 9 through 10, 1938, Jews, Quakers, and Christians working together created a plan to help Jewish children trapped in Germany and without a future. If you're interested to read the debates in Parliament that took place in November 1938, only weeks after November 9th, they're called the Hansard hearings, and they're online, and they're really interesting. With the KTA, we've done various staged readings of portions of them, and they're fascinating and really moving. The rescue mission, now known as the Kindertransports, saved close to 10,000 children, babies to 16 years old, most, but not all, Jewish, from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Danzig, and Poland in the 9 months before World War II, by taking them to safety in the United Kingdom. The children survived the war in foster homes, hostels, schools, farms, and some teenagers were sent to internment camps, even to Australia. The Kindertransports to the United Kingdom were not meant as a path to citizenship. It was a visa waiver scheme. The children were given transit documents to enter the UK, and the plan was for the children to return home when it was safe. No one at that time had any idea what would happen. So the UK, though, had experience with missions of this sort. They took children from Belgium in during World War I and children from Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and they returned them afterwards to their countries of origin. There were also Kindertransports in much smaller numbers, as one panel writes of, to Sweden, France, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Denmark, and the United States. The children sent to France had to flee once again and eventually found safety in the USA. A new book called Who Will Rescue Us has just been published on these Kindertransports to France and then from France to the US. So there are one of the key differences, because the Wagner-Rogers bill didn't pass, is the Kindertransports to the US were sort of smaller numbers of children, and they weren't a visa waiver scheme. They were people figuring out in different locations in the States how to get a hold of visas that had not been used. So there was, I always forget if it's a dentist or a doctor, but there was a couple in Philadelphia who went to Vienna and got 50 children and took them to Philadelphia. And there's a short documentary on HBO or HBO Max or Max, whatever it's called these days, about that. The Children of Dr. Krauss, I think it's called. So the first Kindertransport to the UK left Berlin on December 1st, 1938. The first left Vienna on December 10th. By that time, Jews were registered members of the Jewish community in their cities and towns, and word about the program to send children to safety spread quickly among members of the Jewish community who were desperate to leave somehow to get to safety. As Franzi Dannenberg, a social worker in the Jewish community in Vienna who helped organize the Kindertransports, says in my film, and she's quoted in the exhibit, "We didn't need to announce that we were putting together a children's transport. The information ran like wildfire through the Viennese Jewish families, and naturally, each one wanted to get their children out of Austria, away from this ghetto." In an interview that somehow didn't make it into my film, and I want to say that while my filming to final film ratio was quite small for a documentary, it was still 40 minutes filmed for every 1 minute in the final film. So much on the cutting room floor, and so much that you understand why it's there, and other things that you wish could be in the film somehow. But she, a Kindertransport survivor, told this story to me. At 14 years old, she was in Vienna. She took herself to the Jewish Community Center in Vienna and registered for the Kindertransport, as her parents wanted to stay together as a family. She felt that she had no future in Vienna and that she really needed to get out. She did get on a Kindertransport, and she ended up at Brink Castle in Scotland with 100+ Kindertransport children. Her parents did not get out. The Kindertransports were a massive effort, created and sustained by volunteers and refugee organizations, Quakers, Jews, Christadelphians, and others. There were many committees who worked together, and sometimes not so together, at cross purposes even, to make the Kindertransports happen. After the violence of November 9 through 10, 1938, a consortium of British Jews arranged for Quaker volunteers to travel to Berlin to see what was happening firsthand. They met with members of Jewish communities in Germany and Austria and determined that Jewish parents in the Reich would be willing to send their children away. They had to do this because who knew? Who knew if parents would be? Because England was pretty firm that they didn't want to accept everyone, that they were willing to set up a program for children. There was a separate program they had for domestic workers, which actually took in twice as many. They took in 20,000 domestic workers. And I don't know if any of you have heard of Lori Siegel. She was a Kindertransport survivor from Vienna who died just last year, almost a year ago. She was a dear friend, so I sort of pause when I say that. And she was a wonderful writer, and she wrote, her first book was about her experience as a child. I highly recommend it, called Other People's Houses. And she got out on a Kindertransport, and in sort of what she describes as her first efforts at writing, she would write these letters, these very trying to be poetic letters of saying that she was looking at a red rose in the snow, to people in England to try to find sponsors for her parents. And eventually her parents did get out as domestic workers, her father as a chauffeur and her mother as a cook. There was kind of a fad for Viennese cookery in England at that time. But many, of course, her parents had not worked as a chauffeur or a cook before. But this was a way to get out. But back to this group of Quakers going to look, they had to see if parents would be willing, because they couldn't propose a program, because Parliament in their meetings had specifically said, yeah, we'll help children. We're not interested in helping every adult. But they had to see if this was a program parents would accept. Would they accept sending their children away to strangers, not knowing where they would go, how they would live, who they would live with? And there was no reliable way to really keep in touch regularly. So the committee got the answer that the parents would send their children away, and they gave this report to the Prime Minister at the time, Neville Chamberlain, and he refused this request. No. So a joint Quaker and Jewish delegation met with the Home Secretary. And then there were the debates in Parliament, which, again, you can read. And finally, the Kindertransports were approved. Now, this number of 10,000 children is often thrown around a lot. The program approved to permit an unspecified number of children to enter the UK. So it wasn't a set number. If the war had started later and they had found more homes for children, there would have been more children. It's the only number that we know at this point really concretely is from a report that's also in the exhibit by the Committee for the Care of Children from Germany. And it states that as of July 1939, there were, I think it's 9,356 children sent. So the Kindertransports ran also for August. And the Kindertransports the children were labeled transmigrants, again, to show that they weren't immigrants. They were transmigrants because they were only stopping over in the UK. And a 50-pound bond was required for each child so that they would not become, quote, a burden on the state, unquote. This was a large amount of money, of course. They also had to pay for the train tickets. So public appeals in British newspapers were made by Lord Baldwin, who set up a fund to guarantee the 50 pounds required. And the Archbishop of Canterbury filmed an appeal, which was played before films like a newsreel in theaters. And that raised awareness of the plight of the Jewish children in the Reich and made clear that the British community as a whole should sympathize with the plight of these children and support these children. Local committees were formed to take children to towns and cities throughout the UK. This was all done in haste as it was all finally presented, proposed, and created in a total of 3 weeks. So, the Kindertransport stopped with the outbreak of war, the last train arriving on September 1st, 1939. A Kindertransport survivor told me a story of arriving in London to hear the cries of newspaper sellers saying that war had started. For many years, the Kinder, and that's what we call Kindertransport survivors. Kindertransport is simply the German for children's transport, so we call them Kinder or children, although of course they are no longer children. The Kinder felt isolated, not included in a larger community of Holocaust survivors. Like other child survivors, the Kinder felt that they were so young, perhaps too young to remember, but they do remember. They felt that they were the lucky ones, that nothing really happened to them, and that the parents who were murdered or who survived concentration camps, ghettos, in hiding, their siblings who were murdered, their cousins, their friends who were murdered or survived camps, that they had experienced so much more. They were the ones whose stories should be heard and whose lives should be honored, recognized, and remembered. Who were the Kinder to speak when nothing really happened to them? I want to note that this was definitely the case in my family. As a child, I knew that my mother was different from other mothers. She had an accent, and we ate different food from other families. I don't know if this is a thing here, but if anyone else grew up with the occasional slab of cow tongue appearing on the kitchen counter, which my mother sliced very thin as a delicacy. My sister and I had a very different opinion of this thing. Though we all loved the chocolate sour cherry cake that our grandmother made on special occasions. And our mother had many fears and anxieties. Although she was also a very successful professional woman, there was something about her. There was a family photo album filled with photographs of relatives that I had never met or even heard about. And I knew I was not allowed to ask questions. My mother did not want us to learn German, a language in which she had experienced so much pain in her new life, in a new city, in a new language. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I was able to translate the words scrawled by my grandfather in red crayon across one page, which were my brother murdered in Auschwitz. Especially in the United States, Kindertransport history was unknown for many years and is still far too little known, so speaking of it at all would require much explanation of the pain and sorrow. Most of the Kindertransport children never saw their parents again. See? So a note here that the day that the first Kindertransport arrived on December 2nd, 1938 in Harwich, England, by ferry from Hook of Holland, was a bit of a media spectacle, with newspaper photographers and newsreel cameras filming. And so that this photo is from that first Kindertransport, as is this and this. So many of the children, also, in a funny thing someone told me, who was on that first Kindertransport, some of the children were then taken to a movie theater in Harwich and shown a film with a famous Austrian actress who had fled earlier, and that was remade by Bette Davis. And I can't remember the title now, but the person who told me this found it very confusing, like arriving after this journey and being bombarded with flashes and then being taken to this movie theater. So many of the children had particular sponsors that had been arranged through a variety of means, family contacts, newspaper advertisements, and another book has recently been written about this. It's called I Seek a Kind Person, My Father, 7 Children, and the Adverts That Helped Them Escape the Holocaust. This is by Julian Borger, a reporter for The Guardian, and who did a book talk with the Kindertransport Association, which when I get back to New York in a little while, it will be available to view on our website. So his father's sponsor was found through an advertisement placed in the Manchester Guardian. In one case, a family friend who was a Fuller brush salesman went door to door in the UK selling brushes and asking if people would take in a homeless Jewish child from Germany. My mother was sent to Liverpool Street Station in London, where she was met by a friend of the family who had fled Vienna several months earlier. This friend of the family took her to her first foster home. And I say first, as my mother recalled crying nonstop and being sent from one foster family to the next, a total of 8, as no one wanted to keep a crying, non-English-speaking 12-year-old. Eventually, she found a family she loved with a daughter her age and a 6-year-old brother, and they stayed together throughout the time my mother was in England, even being evacuated together, the 3 of them, and no one wanted 3 children, so they were sent to a woman they called the Witch, who fed their meat rations to her Scottish Terrier dogs, which gave my mother a lifelong hatred of those dogs. There's a photo of the 3 of them in the exhibit. And I knew my mother's foster brother and foster sister all my life. What others were sent to summer camps. Let me see. Yes. Others were sent to summer camps near Harwich in Dovercourt and Pakeville, unheated summer camps in the coldest winter in 50 years. Local committee members throughout the UK traveled down there, sort of an hour and a half outside of London, to these camps to select children and say, okay, I'll take 2 to Liverpool, 3 to Manchester, etc. Erica Estes said in my film, it was a summer camp in the winter, very muddy, up to our knees in mud, and very cold. People would show up there and look around and see who they would want to take into their houses. And of course, nobody would want me. I was a teenager, and they weren't interested in teenagers. They wanted little children, and they were the ones that they would take. And I remember sort of parading around trying to be on your best behavior because you really did want to be picked. You knew you couldn't stay there forever. It was cold and uncomfortable, and it was so obviously temporary. But of course, I wouldn't want me either if I was there right now. Some Britons gave money. Some, like the Schlesinger family, the parents of the director John Schlesinger, who made Midnight Cowboy, among other films, set up a hostel in London for 13 Kindertransport children from Berlin. As this rescue mission was set up so quickly, some children were placed in inappropriate homes where they were used as servants, not allowed to continue their educations, or were abused. Erica Estes, in fact, was abused. But then later in life, she had a wonderful family life. And I only learned this after, when I went to her Shiva, that after that, I knew that when I interviewed her for the film, she had never spoken about this in detail, about her experience as growing up and on the Kindertransports. And what I didn't, and I was very grateful that she was able to open up to me, what I didn't realize, and her granddaughter told me, was that it was only after the film that she started speaking in schools, both in New York where she lived and in Frankfurt. And she ended up speaking repeatedly at the school that is still, it's a very different school, but it's in the same place where she went to school. So she did go through a healing process of some sort. So at the time, individual foster homes were preferred as the ideal because it would be creating a home. Now we realize that the outcome was better for children in group homes because when they were in group homes, they had each other. They had other kids they could talk to who were going through the same thing, similar things, and could comfort each other and understand what was happening. All of the children were traumatized, and all of them were worried for their parents who were trying to get out of Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland. Letters came at first, but eventually stopped. That's Dover Court again. Okay, so before I get to this slide, often the last Kindertransport is noted as a ship from the Netherlands that carried children to England in May 1940 as German troops marched in. Children were rushed from a Jewish orphanage in Amsterdam to a ship in a harbor on fire, and they arrived in the UK safely. Many of the Kindertransport children who stayed in the Netherlands did not survive. As the most vulnerable of refugees, children without family, with no one who knew them to hide them, they were gathered at Westerbork, deported to Auschwitz, and murdered. Most of the children never saw their parents again, as they were murdered in the Holocaust. The Kindertransports from Czechoslovakia, which this is an image of, were started in January 1939 after the Kindertransport scheme had been running. But as Czechoslovakia was not yet occupied by the Nazis, it had not been included in the original agreement that was worked out with Parliament. It was only for children in the Reich. And at that time, Czechoslovakia was not. So it was really due to the efforts of Nicholas Winton and others working together that these Kindertransports were started from Czechoslovakia. So this is an image of Nicholas Winton at the airport in Czechoslovakia, and you have that whole film clip in the exhibit. Now, he's putting children on a plane to London in February 1939, and I have a really personal relationship to this image. I was the first person ever to use that footage, and I know because I had to pay the National Archives to make what's called a safety master before they would let me use it. I learned that in searching in dusty boxes and files, that this was filmed for a Universal newsreel, but it was never used. It was filmed and filed and not even edited, just put away. I found in an old file cabinet drawer with paper files. I'm so nostalgic for these analog things. But a card with a note from the cameraman. He was so moved by seeing this scene of parents and children separating and children being put on a plane that he asked the pilot to call him when he arrived safely in London, and the pilot did. When I was in Jerusalem at a Kindertransport reunion where I had been asked to screen an early work in progress of my film, I showed this clip, and I thought this was an image of a father putting his child on the plane. After the screening, Greta Winton came up to me and said, "That's Nikki, you know." I had not known, but now I do, and we all do, because that's a really much used image. There was also, at that same screening, a hubbub in the audience when some of the archival footage from the Dovercourt camp played. And a man afterwards told me that he said, "I saw a boy playing with his spoon, and that was my best friend. I was really happy to see my best friend playing with his spoon. After watching him, I realized that I must be sitting right next to him. And I turned my gaze and I saw myself." I was really happy that I could share with him where he could find a copy of this footage so he could share it with his family on the USHMM website. So these are, you can see this in the gallery too, parents waving goodbye to their children. So, new research on the Kindertransports. As I noted earlier, the Kindertransport children themselves felt for many years that they weren't really Holocaust survivors. They were the lucky ones. Nothing happened to them. They didn't talk much, especially not publicly or in schools, until 10 to 15 years ago. And still, other than in the UK, where they've taken this as a national story of heroism and rescue, the Kindertransports were very little known or studied. And it's not until recently that details are coming to light, who and how exactly the Kindertransports were organized, and the many people, men and women, who were involved. In the last 5 years, Paul Weidling, who was a maths professor at Oxford, has done wonderful research in the Vienna archives, showing, for example, how children were selected and how they were rejected. So what happened was, in Vienna, when children went, or parents brought them, to the Jewish Community Center, they worked with social workers like Franzi Dannenberg. They had to show medical records, they had to get photos taken, and the social workers also tried to write something, both about the family conditions, because there were priorities that at the beginning were more adhered to than later on. Like, a child who was an orphan was a higher priority than a child with both parents. A child who had a parent in jail was a high priority. But she would also try to ask them something to make them humanized. Like, she would ask, what do you do with your arms? And try to get the child to say something like, "I use my arms to hug my mother." Because she didn't know that all of the paperwork would be sent to Great Britain, to the committee, and then a list of names would come back. And they never knew in Vienna why some children were approved and why some children were not approved. So Paul has done research and found out that there were reasons. Too Jewish looking, that's a too Jewish looking, yes, or had some, one girl was ruled as being too anxious. Well, she was really too anxious because her mother had just killed herself recently. But this is really interesting and hasn't been known for so long. And he is a KT2 himself. His mother was on a Kindertransport from Vienna. So he had to go actually to Jerusalem to look at these records because unfortunately the Vienna Jewish Community Center does not at this time have enough resources to support research there. And It's really tragic. He found a letter that a girl wrote to Elizabeth, who was her age, trying to say how much she was like her and she'd love to meet her, and he traced her fate. She did not get on a Kindertransport and was murdered in Sobibor. So this is a list of the Kindertransports from Vienna, and it's showing the numbers and the dates and when they went and when they arrived. And these lists like this have long been available, but it's also long been thought that comprehensive records of the Kindertransport children might be impossible to locate, scattered throughout the world, some in the Archives of World Jewish Relief in London, the successor organization of the Committee for the Care of Refugee Children, which managed many of the children in the U.S., others perhaps in archives in the cities of origin, or possibly destroyed. As an example, it seems that when children left the UK, if they re-immigrated to America or Australia during the war, their records with the committee may have been destroyed, as the committees were then no longer responsible for the children because they were no longer in the UK. They were a working organization and they weren't thinking about future historians. World Jewish Relief is currently doing really great work distributing records to Kindertransport descendants. And we're learning more all the time. Andrea Hamill just published a book called The Kindertransports: What Really Happened. And Amy Williams, a young historian who has been working with the KTA, has been traveling the world locating Kindertransport records. She's writing a book for Yale University Press that's due in 2027. She and her co-author, Bill Niven, recently did a talk for the KTA, which unfortunately will not be available on the website, as Amy has not yet cleared things with the archives. However, she's working with the Association for Jewish Refugees in the UK on creating a database of Kindertransport children that will be available online for the 90th year commemorations in 28-29. But she's gotten, and this is our book talk, but she has gotten tremendous press. You can see there was an article in the New York Times, and then the writer who had interviewed me contacted me again. There was so much interest. There were like 300 comments in her first article that she was asked to write a second article on the Kindertransports, where she interviewed some Kindertransport survivors. So you can find these if you search Kindertransport in the Times. So that's Amy and Bill doing their talk. This is, so the current estimate, and these estimates are changing all the time, maybe the database will answer all the questions, is that the Kindertransport saved 10 through 15,000 children, babies through 17 years old. This is my mother's cousin, Polly. He did not escape on a Kindertransport and was murdered in Auschwitz at 5 years old. Over 1 million children were murdered. We must remember not only the children saved by Kindertransports, but the children and parents whose lives were taken. I want to speak just briefly about Kindertransport Children to Kindertransport Association. This is a nonprofit which was founded by Kindertransport survivors in 1990 and held a first reunion in the fall of 1990 in the Catskills and at a former Jewish summer resort, and that's where I did my first filming. So in the years after the war, Kindertransport survivors who had spent time together in group homes, hostels, and farms had reunited as family. But it wasn't until Bertha Leverton, until the 50th year after the Kindertransports, that Bertha Leverton, a Kindertransport survivor originally from Munich living in London, thought, let's get together everyone who was on a Kindertransport. And she put out the word. Various Jewish organizations helped get the word out. And in June 1989, over 1,200 people, Kindertransport survivors with spouses and children, gathered together in London from throughout the UK, Israel, South America, Canada, Australia, and even Nepal. Eddie Berendt, who was a kin from Danzig, traveled from New York to attend this reunion. And for a stoic gentleman, it was a profound emotional experience. He wrote of the London reunion, "I had rarely thought or spoken about the early experiences of my childhood, and knew of no one else who had fled the Holocaust to England on a Kindertransport. At these meetings, I even met some that came to England on the same train as I. I wept for the first time in many years. Eddie was inspired to create something in the US, something more than, quote, just hugs, kisses, talks, and memories. He wanted to create something lasting, something that would be open to all generations, and something that would help contemporary children at risk. He got together a group of kinder in New York, some of whom were people he knew already, but they had never talked about their pasts. And it was only after this London reunion that they learned that they had all escaped via Kindertransport. And this small group of kinder created the KTA. I know we started late, so I'm going to whiz through a couple slides. So I just want to talk a little bit about the original KTA logo, which you see on your left, when we redesigned our logo 3 years ago, I spoke to the second generation person who designed the original logo. And she explained that the kinder who founded the KTA had struggled with finding a visual representation of their feelings and of the groundbreaking organization they were creating. Today, when we think of the Kindertransports, a train or suitcase might come to mind, but the kinder then felt that the ferry from Hook of Holland to Harwich was a key turning point, taking them away from the land they knew and cutting them out of their childhood. Jen built on this idea and designed the logo you see with the silhouettes of children cut out of the ship, facing an uncertain future. After 30 years, we decided to create a new logo, and this features 2 children and wearing their tags. And on the boy is the number worn by Eddie Barrett, the founder of the KTA, and the girl wears the number, I took license here, that was worn by my mother. So 30 years on, the KTA is small. This is not all the KTA members. This is all the kinder at a gathering in New York a few years ago. The KTA is small but productive, and with 1 part-time staff person, which would be me, and a dedicated team of volunteers, we're looking to both the past and the future, seeking to honor this legacy, to support the kinder, to engage the next generations, and make meaningful contributions to the world today. We have now 3 generations on our board, and the legacy is strong. Before we get to questions and discussion, which I'm really looking forward to, I want to take 2 minutes to bring the voices of 4 Kindertransport survivors into the room. This was filmed on a trip taken in 2019, which was the 80th year of the Kindertransports.
In my recollections, I could just see my classroom and my response to being told that the Jewish children had to leave, and that I suddenly realized that I had been living amongst people who hated me.
I wanted to try and imagine what it felt like as a 3-year-old toddler to be taken from the arms of his parents and put onto a train.
I received a card from the International Red Cross in 1942 saying that your parents were murdered at Auschwitz. I don't know where they're buried, if they were buried at all.
I think the biggest thing that I would like future generations to learn from our experiences that good people can do a lot of good with the will to do it. It's the biggest lesson you should learn in your life, is that if you do that with any kind of will, you can do a lot of good.
So now we'll hear from you.
So as a reminder, please write your questions on the note cards and our staff will come and pick them up. And I have a few starters.
Okay.
Before the official starter, your mother's parents survived?
Yeah, my mother's parents, as I said, they couldn't leave because they were waiting for my grandfather's number to come up. Eventually his number came up, and Britain had a program where they allowed people, Jewish refugees whose visa numbers to the U.S. had arrived, but they didn't have their ship's passage arranged. They had a program to allow them to come to the U.K., and which saved the lives of my grandparents because they were able to leave Vienna just in August of 1939, just before the war started.
Amazing.
Yeah. But they couldn't live together in England. My mother knew that they were safe, and she knew, but they were penniless child refugees,
Right.
so they didn't really have a place to live, and she was by then with the foster family that she loved. So
Great.
Yeah.
I'm glad they survived.
Thank you.
Bert and Maggie's mother also survived, and she came through the domestic worker program. So there were a few happy endings. As the war came to a close, where did the Kinder go, and how did they come to learn of the fate of their families?
So after the war, there were a couple buildings, important buildings in London, where the refugee committee was located, and those would post lists on their walls. As the lists came out of survivors from the camps, they would post lists, and as the list came out of people who didn't survive. So Erica Estes tells another story of she would go there all the time as she was a teenager by then, and an older teenager, and when she finally found her parents' list, her parents' names on the list, she was so upset. She said it was Passover, and she went to a restaurant and ate real food. And she said she got really sick, but she felt, this was, how could God do this? And
Right.
But so they did find lists, and the parents, sometimes for parents who survived, even it took years for them because they couldn't just get to England. It took many years to get reunited, and in many cases, the parents had survived whatever they went through, thinking of their 5-year-old or 6-year-old, and then by the time they were reunited, it was with a teenager who, in many cases, didn't speak the same language.
Right.
So while it was really wonderful, there were also difficulties in the
Very
reunions.
difficult.
Yeah.
And Britain, you said it meant for it to be temporary, but did they allow citizenship for some of the children?
After the war, when they realized that most of the children had no parents to go home to, they allowed them to become citizens. Many of the children stayed in Britain. Many emigrated to America if they had any relatives at all in America, and others went to Israel and South America. In cases where their parents had escaped to South America, they would go to join them. They really did scatter all over the world.
Okay. And you mentioned that some of the Kinder struggled with connecting with older survivors since they were so young when the war broke out. Now that a large number of living survivors were children or teenagers during the Holocaust, how do you think their roles have shifted as they continue to share their stories?
I think things have definitely changed for child survivors and Kindertransport survivors, that they have been more accepted as part of the survivor community, and they've accepted themselves as part of the Holocaust survivor community, and they are speaking more in part, because of the aging issue. They have been stepping up, and so I think it's a complicated question, but I think they are feeling more included and whole in their identities as people survivors who terrible things happen to that no child should see or experience. So yeah.
You can't compare suffering, right?
Right.
But,
it's this hierarchy of suffering, which
Right.
I have to say, I feel the second generation clings to that much more than the first.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's a question about how families learned about the Kindertransport. You said it spread like wildfire, but it would, so the Jewish organization in Germany or in a town would find out, and how did it?
Right. So the exact details of how it was spread, whether it was spread in printed newsletters or whether it was spread by phone calls, are currently not known. But because everyone was registered, word could get out to all the Jewish families.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do we know if any kinder perished in the Blitz or other bombings?
We don't know about that. I know many of them were evacuated, and I know some were not evacuated also, because the foster families they were with chose not to evacuate. I think it's probably likely, but I don't know for a fact.
Why would the British not want adults to come with their children outside of their domestic worker program?
So my first response is that a rhetorical question? But my actual real response is I had a friend, Robert Sugar, who was a kind, who would always say, why didn't we march? Why didn't we march as an army of children in Trafalgar Square and say, get our parents out? He knew he was saying that to be provocative because, of course, they couldn't.
Right.
But the same, why didn't America take in more refugees? Britain, if you read the Hansard hearings, you'll see they don't, they had anti-Semitism. Also, the Jewish community in Britain in London especially, was largely poorer and Russian and wasn't particularly interested in helping these wealthier, or they thought wealthier, more Western European Jews. But the powers that be in Britain weren't exactly excited about bringing in Jews. And it's the same, even as children, they would eventually grow up and take jobs away from British citizens. Situation that children are cute. You can take, they're cute, they're little, you can maybe change them when you raise them. Some children were converted, not too many. And the refugee committees did a very good job of keeping track. They didn't, like has been done in other countries like this one, on purpose separate the paperwork so that parents couldn't easily reunite with their children. They kept track really quite well.
That's great. Given the dates of the transports, did Winston Churchill have any role in this effort?
Not as far as I know. He wasn't participating in the parliamentary hearings, but yeah.
Do you know roughly a percentage of how many of the kinder were reunited with their parents?
So again, it's one of the questions. When we were working, I was a consultant on this exhibit. I was always the one saying, don't say numbers, don't say numbers. So when I made my film, the general thought was 80% never saw their parents again. It's now thought to be around 60% never saw their parents again. If this database gets done in 2 or 3 years from now, that's one of the things it wants to track, is that because the records Amy has found have both the name of the child and the parents. So that would be a way of tracking. But really in the past, the only sort of broad surveys that have been done were done by the Association of Jewish Refugees and the Kindertransport Association. And they got about, I think, over 1,000 responses, but that's still only 10%. And it was done in the early 2000s. So you had to be alive still in the 2000s, which many weren't even then. And you had to be a member of the Association of Jewish Refugees or the Kindertransports to fill out that survey. So, exact numbers, hopefully we'll be able to know more if the database is created.
Incomplete.
Yeah.
One of the local families that we cover, Susie Levy, was the mother of one of our past board members. She and her mother went on the domestic servant program, but they were sent to the Isle of Man, I think, as internments.
An internment
Can you
camp.
talk about the internments a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So Britain was concerned about enemy aliens, about German spies, and plans to invade Britain. So they set up these camps also for German prisoners of war and people they saw as enemy aliens. And many
Similar in the U.S.
Sorry?
I said we had those in the U.S. too.
Right.
Internment camps. Go ahead.
Internment camps. Those weren't necessarily even for enemy aliens. Those were for Japanese American citizens of the U.S. But yeah,
well, and Germans and Italians.
And I don't know if I would call it past tense at this moment in time either. So they set up internment camps in the Isle of Man and a few other places, and some were even in Canada and Australia. There was a ship called the Donera that the crew thought that all of the people on it were German Nazis. And so they treated them very, very terribly. And many of them were not German Nazis. So in these internment camps, they were mixed together, refugee Jews and Nazis. And it was terrible for many. There's a recent book, again with the recent books, but just last year, a book about one of the internment camps, which I can't remember the name of, but that was very interesting because there were a lot for the Jewish prisoners there and refugees, older kinder, and it's really telling the story of a boy who is in the footage that's in the gallery on the bus. You can see his face. And there were painters and writers and artists of all sorts in this camp who were giving lessons. And he had painting lessons there. So they created even in this sort
community.
of other worst of times, they created a supportive community.
Right.
So, but yes, people did get caught up in the internment camps. Also, some Kindertransport older girls were in the Bletchley Circle, working on code cracking.
Wow, amazing.
Yeah.
Are there resources on your website that have books and films about the Kindertransport so
Yes.
we can go?
Yes, we have a pretty large resource list. We really try to keep it updated where we have books and websites and that you can search. And yes, we try to be a resource.
Fabulous. Well, final question.
Okay.
How can we each help ensure the memory of the Kindertransports doesn't fade?
The same way. So it's interesting. There was a presentation at the conference that I was just at in Paris on new ways of approaching Holocaust memorialization. And one on a small scale was the Zikaron Ba Salam, which is talking at homes, and it's kind of a structured talking thing for small groups. It's quite interesting. A lot of the third generation is doing that. But now so there's the whole question of survivors talking to students has been seen as the most impactful way to teach Holocaust history to students. And yes, it's really been impactful, but it's also there's some way that it really hasn't worked in the way that people thought it would solve all the problems of anti-Semitism. And it hasn't done that. But and there's right now a sort of contrasting methodology. Like some people are really into the holograms as a solution. I think and others are training the second and third generation to speak. I mean, I think there's some kind of combination of second or third generation speakers speaking with a hologram, like telling their, a little bit, my parent went through this, and so there's a connection, and the students can talk to them, not just the hologram. So we do have a speaker training program. And also what's worked really beautifully is Kindertransport survivor and a member of the third generation, whether related to them or not, speaking together. People have loved that.
Oh, wonderful.
But yeah, we all have to try to figure out ways. And there's some books. You have some great, couple of great children's books in the bookstore. And Barbara Winton's book about her father is wonderful.
We have several 2G speakers, and they do a PowerPoint that have video clips of their parents, and it's really impactful. Yeah. And our next program about the Kindertransport on October 22nd, I hope that's the right date, Carol. Yes. Will be Melanie Kruer talking about her mother, Suzanne's journey on the Kindertransport. So it's really, we have to do everything we can to keep this history alive because it's relevant today.
Yeah, I mean, I also think the Kindertransport story is really well positioned to teach in schools because children and teenagers can relate to the story of someone their age, the story of someone their age, and it's not the horror that can become numbers, that can become unimaginable and should be unimaginable for children of the concentration camps. It's a child being sent away. And also there are so many refugees and immigrants in schools today that they can learn another refugee story and see, oh, other
alone.
people went through things like me, and it can become better.
Yeah.
And it also shows how people from far away can take action and save lives. So
And help others be more empathetic.
Yes.
Yeah, all of the
Yes.
above.
Yeah.
Well, Melissa, thank you so much for your work. Thank you for
you
being
for
with us
inviting me.
tonight. Thank you
Thank
all
you.
for being with us. I hope that if you haven't seen the exhibition, please take your time. We'll be open until 9. Or if you want to come back, we'd love that too. So it's open through the middle of February. So spread the word and bring others to come see this important exhibition.
And I didn't even mention there's my mother's gold Jewish star on a chain that was sewn in the lining of her coat on the Kindertransport train is in the exhibit.
Yay. Maybe you should go in the exhibit and show people some of this stuff.
I don't know if I quite have it in me to give a tour, but I'm happy to answer questions and talk to people individually. And I put some Kindertransport Association newsletters and charming little bookmarks out front. So
Terrific.
take them.
Thank you. Thank you all for being with us. Good
Thank you
evening.
all.